Good morning. What you're looking at is basically our 7th breakfast on the moon. We started doing this actually as a Zoom presentation coming out of our local chapter, that's the Sacramento L5 Society in California. And that was for Apollo 10. And by the way, one interesting thing, we're going to be celebrating today Apollo 17. And it turns out that Apollo 10 and Apollo 17 had a crew member that was on both missions, and that was Eugene Cernan. The first time on Apollo 10, Eugene Cernan did not actually get to land. He got within a few hundred feet of the moon, but he wasn't allowed to land. So it was some vindication, I think, that on the very last of the lunar missions, the Apollo missions, he got to actually land on the moon. So good on him, and good on the people that gave him that chance. I think that's only fair. Okay, so these breakfasts are, in fact, a celebration of Apollo missions. This particular one is Apollo 17. And in each one, we've had people doing presentations or even some panels where we have panel discussions. This time, we're going to have a presentation from Mr. Ron Jones. As you can see, the gentleman in the checkered shirt, brown checkered shirt, with the green chair. And also joining us is Christine Noby, who is instrumental in us even having this, because she basically said to me, hey, you know, Joe, have you ever thought about the fact that we're 1 year away from the last time we walked on the moon? And I went, no, that's fascinating. And so she said, have you thought about having a breakfast on the moon to celebrate that as a kind of countdown? And I said, no, that's great. So thanks to Christine, we're here celebrating the 1 year countdown to the last time we walked on the moon. So Christine, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us what you think of the day and all that.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I am glad to be here. There's a little bit of chaos behind me because we just moved, and I could not find a spot in the condominium that had a blank wall and was close enough to the Wi-Fi to get service. Kind of a little bit of a mess here, which also explains a little bit about what was happening today. My idea was that we would have the breakfast on the moon, and then that would kick off the St. Louis Space Frontier, which is also part of the National Space Society. So that would kick off our Gateway to Space. Gateway to Space 2021 is going to take place in 2022. So we'll have that, we're thinking, in February. So if you all would kind of keep an eye on that. We've got speakers who have volunteered to participate. I am an educator. I taught gifted education for decades, and now I'm actually the director of gifted education for our Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It's a busy time in education right now. So that's my intro, and I will be listening and paying close attention today. I love Ron's stories, and so with that, maybe Ron would like to share a little bit about him.
Sure. Thank you, Christine. And I might add, in all the years that I've known Christine, this is the first time I've ever heard her use the words, she didn't get it all together. Because Christine is one of the most get it together people I've ever met in my life. So you're forgiven this one time, Christine.
I appreciate that. It turns out that moving is very, very, very challenging.
I know that, and I'm thinking of doing the same thing, and I haven't really got into it. Anyway, so yeah, I came to St. Louis in right after 9/11, actually, to work for Boeing. And I'm one of those guys that's been just very fortunate in life. I've worked in aerospace, kind of following my dreams since I was a child. But, you know, I've never spoken publicly about it. I have given talks about my college internship, not high school. But in retrospect, looking back at all of it, like I've been doing this last week for me has been a trip down memory road. These experiences have been nothing less than extraordinary. So I changed the title of the talk this morning. I threw in the word extraordinary, and I was trying to think how I might throw in the word adventure. It was an adventure, considering I grew up a space cadet. You know, I grew up with Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. I got up as a kid, you know, at 5, 6 in the morning to watch every Mercury and Gemini and Apollo mission. Of course, Apollo was when I was in my teens, 16, 17, 18. So I've been a space cadet since the early days. So to live this life in aerospace, working for Rockwell and Boeing and these other organizations that directly contributed to the space program was nothing less than a great thrill for me. And so I know I've been blessed. You know, if somebody out there knows of similar experiences as an intern, I'd really like to hear it. You know, I just wonder. I mean, maybe someday there ought to be a website of intern experiences, because I'd really like to know how mine stack up against. I'm sure there are thousands of NASA interns. But anyway, so yeah, so that's me. I will touch upon all this background, and I'm relying on Joe and Christine to give me a signal to get off this page or, you know, move on, because I will probably talk more than I need to.
Oh, well, that's saying a lot. And you got the signal, man. Go for it.
Oh, so I can put my screen up?
You bet.
Okay, so this was originally meant to be my experiences on and remembrances of Apollo 17. And after talking to Joe, he said I could expand that a little bit to some of my other NASA intern experiences. So I changed the title this morning from to, you know, remembering Apollo 17 and other extraordinary experiences of one NASA intern. All right, so let's start here. Let me see. All right, so I don't know, those of you that don't know me, just a quick overview. I'm 68 years old now, and I started working at NASA when I was 17. So I've been in aerospace for 50 years. I live in San Francisco, Silicon Valley area. So just south of me, about 4-hour drive, is Vandenberg Air Force Base, now Vandenberg Space Force Base. And they were planning to launch the space shuttle out of there for the DoD. So long story short, I did get a job at Vandenberg on the space shuttle. I was lucky enough to work I worked requirements for the ground requirements for the shuttle and for the first payload, which for years I couldn't talk about, and I've never mentioned this publicly, but I worked on the Teal Ruby program, which was highly classified at the time. I worked ground support, what it took to keep that, satellite, give it everything it needed before we actually put it onto the shuttle. After that, then Challenger happened when I was at Vandenberg, and that was a big, that changed everything at Vandenberg. Ended up getting laid off with 3,000 other people working the space shuttle as the Air Force backed out of manned space, and went down to Los Angeles, went to work for Rockwell, and I worked on they called it the Shuttle Return to Flight Mission, STS-26. So I I worked program requirements for the shuttle program, and I actually worked in the backup mission control room. I shouldn't say backup, but just like the mission control room in Houston, we had one in Los Angeles, where Rockwell is, because Rockwell's is where all the systems engineers were that designed all the instrumentation, everything on the space shuttle. Rockwell built the space shuttle. So we had kind of a backup, our own mission control room. In fact, it was called the mission control room, I think. And I actually worked in that mission control room. I had you see these pictures of guys with screens in front of them. And I had one that looked at all the overall systems on the shuttle. And I got a chance to work the STS-26 when we returned to flight. In fact, I should be pointing out some of these pictures. That's, here's the shuttle, and then this picture down here, I hope you can see, is of the crew. They came out, in one morning. It's like, about 4 in the morning, and I was working. Of course, I got the bad shift. And, they were wearing their sunglasses and Hawaiian shirts and playing the ukulele. It was kind of a funny thing. Anyway, so, and I should also add that where this big arrow is up here on the top, this top line of pictures is what I'll be primarily talking about. So, this picture up here is the shuttle at Vandenberg, totally different launch site than Cape Kennedy. And one of my jobs at Vandenberg was to was to actually in place all the engineering cameras around the launch pad. And so I got a chance to spend a lot of time at Cape Kennedy, going all over pad 39, looking at all the engineering cameras, looking at the angles, because we wanted to get have all the same critical angles at Vandenberg. I worked other things too, but that was so I got lots of neat pictures of the shuttle from every angle of Vandenberg. Anyway, went to Rockwell, worked return to flight. And also while I was at Rockwell, after STS-26 lifted off successfully, I ended up in the advanced projects group. And it was, working futuristic stuff, Mars-based, moon-based, just during President Bush space, he announced the space SEI, Space Exploration Initiative. So it was in that time that I built this thing over here. A lot of you I've talked about this many times. I came up with the idea for the Integrated Space Plan, which was about 120-year look into the future, which laid out all of the critical steps that we had to go through, all the requirements, all the vehicles that had to be developed to move from where we were then with the space shuttle to all the way to space settlements, O'Neill type colonies. All the infrastructure had to be put in place in a rational, logical way. Now, the time frame isn't quite right from that original one, but all the elements are still good. Then during that, I met Buzz Aldrin. This is another long story. I got a call one day out of the clear blue, but Buzz calls me, and he was down in Houston at a conference on Moonbase. This is like 1987, 88 timeframe. And he was looking at this integrated space plan on a wall down there at the Johnson Spacecraft Center, and he thought it was fantastic. And he called me up and said, "Hey, I'm coming home tomorrow, and I want to go to Rockwell, and I want to meet all of the young engineers, working this stuff at Rockwell." Now, I had just kind of gone into the advanced projects group, and that Monday, my boss, for some reason, was out sick or on vacation or something. So I had to go to his boss and tell him, "Hey, I got a call from Buzz Aldrin this weekend, and he wants to come in," or I guess he wanted to come in on Tuesday, and meet with all the young guys. And he specifically said he wanted to meet with young people. Well, my boss's boss looked at me, kind of smiled, and he said, "Sure." It turns out he only invited all the old guys. I was the youngest guy in the room. And, Buzz gave a presentation, and it was a great presentation, I thought. It didn't go over really big at Rockwell at the time, because the stuff he was talking about, Rockwell wasn't really doing. And they didn't have any visionaries in that group. except for maybe the young guy. So anyway, after that meeting was over, Buzz and I went out to lunch, and I asked him, "What are you going to do now, Buzz?" And he goes, "Well, I'm heading to Washington tomorrow." And I go, "Oh, really? Who are you going to see?" "Oh, I'm going to see the NASA administrator." And I said, "Oh, what are you going to talk about?" He goes, "I'm going to show him the same charts I showed you." Now, this is like in the late 80s, we didn't have PowerPoint, you know, and he had briefed us. In the old days, we had these transparencies that had an overhead projector, and it was all grease pencil, and it was all really, you know, handwritten, kind of, you know, didn't look very good. Now, at the same time frame, we had just, and obviously I did the integrated space plan. The integrated space plan, by the way, was the first thing I ever did in my life on a Mac. I mean, on a computer. And we had a Macintosh in our group, and I stayed after hours, and it took about a year and a half to put that thing together initially. But I only had 10 minutes of instruction from one of our young interns on how to use the Mac. He just taught me how to draw squares, how to draw circles, and how to draw lines. That's all I needed, because if you ever look at the integrated space plan, all it is circles, lines, and squares. And anyway, 18 months later, I had this plan. So anyway, Buzz, I said, "You can't show the NASA administrator these charts." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "Well, I just told him they didn't look very good." So I said, "Why don't you give me your charts, and I'll see what I can do with them tonight." So I had bought my own Mac at home, and I went home and I took all his charts and I made them look really pretty, designed a little logo for him, and brought him to him the next day. Now, he lived in Laguna Beach, I lived in Huntington Beach, so we were right close to one another down the Pacific Coast Highway. And oh, he loved it, you know, boom. So I started working for Buzz then. So I worked for Buzz for a whole lot for about 15 or 20 years. You know, I worked for him. I was the executive director and vice president of his nonprofit called ShareSpace. And I was also involved in pushing Star Booster concept in Washington. Star Booster was exactly what Elon Musk is doing right now, a returnable first stage. And in the late 1990s, 2000 timeframe, Buzz and I we were there full time in Washington, D.C. We talked to everybody in Washington. We talked to the presidents, vice presidents of Lockheed, Boeing, Martin, Rockwell. We talked to any congressman that mattered, any senator that mattered. And when you got a request to go in and talk to a senator or a congressman, when you had a request and you were going to bring in Buzz Aldrin, you actually sat down with the congressman and the senator, not the lackey legislative assistants. Anyway, we talked to everybody, tried to sell them on what should replace the shuttle. We should have and the next system had to be totally reusable. His concept, Star Booster, I don't have time to go into it now, but it was a remarkable system for a minimal investment. We could take existing hardware and fly it again. Key element was an Atlas rocket that we've been flying since forever, and slap an aluminum airframe around it with wings. So when the booster went up and ran out of fuel, it would just turn around, fly back to the landing site, and recover it. And then you just pull the rocket out, change the engines, refuel it, whatever, put it back in, and it's ready to go again. Anyway, long story short, Boeing, Rockwell, Martin, they said, what's in that for us? You want to use the same rocket 10 times over, and we're getting $200 million a piece for each rocket that flies. This just didn't make sense to them. And it wasn't until Elon Musk came along and forced their hand that we have what's going on today. So anyway, too much time on that one. I did going on, I did get a chance to actually fly payloads on the shuttle in my later life. Actually, I was about 2011, 12, 13. I worked for a little company, that guy that I'd met, John Casanto, while I was living and working in Washington, D.C. He had a little company that was flying small mini labs on the shuttle. In fact, he was one of the first guys to fly commercial experiments on the space shuttle. So I started working with him when I was in DC, and the first thing I started helping him, I wasn't really helping him, but he was like supplying me with all the, what was required to put something on the shuttle. During, I was there in 2001, 2002. I was still in, not 2000, 2001, still in DC, but that's when the Columbia disaster happened. John had a number of experiments on the Columbia. And, I got up one morning and watched it, and boom, that was that. So now it turns out they found some of John's experiments on the ground in a parking lot, made the front page of the Los Angeles Times, or no, New York Times. And John immediately contacted NASA and said, "Oh, you got my payload. It's in it's on the front page of the Times this morning." Anyway, NASA took its sweet time getting back. It wasn't until like 4 or 5 months later that they actually gave him his payload back. Well, he had time-sensitive experiments on there. He had a cancer. It was a cancer experiment. Long story short, he ended up suing NASA. Now, when you sue NASA and you fly into space on their vehicles, well, forget it. You ain't flying again. And so we didn't fly again, till STS-134 and 135, the last 2 shuttle launches. So I was the number 2 guy on that, and on the last 2 shuttle flights. We did fly 44 professional and student experiments, and some of the professional experiments spent 8 weeks on board the space station and grew some proprietary crystals. So that was a really neat experience, that whole thing, pulling those together down at Cape Kennedy, turning the payloads over to NASA, just a wonderful thing. At Boeing, I went to, so by the way, this is one of our experiments that flew. It flew on both STS-134 and 135, a little mini lab, about a foot long. There it is in space. Let's see. This picture down here, when I went to work for Boeing, I've worked on a number of projects. One of the neatest was they sent me to Albuquerque, New Mexico to work on a 3.5-meter telescope, part of the Starfire. It was the main part of the Starfire optical range. And this telescope was, now I'm into telescopes, as you'll find out. This is used adaptive optics, which means, and they didn't use this telescope to look at stars. They were using it to look at satellites, to look primarily at Russian and Chinese satellites to verify what they were. If they were really communication satellites or spy satellites, because they didn't always tell us what they really were. The way that, how do you look at a satellite through a telescope? I didn't put any of the pictures here from that. I probably should have. But it uses adaptive optics, and that's a whole long story with using laser beams like showing down there. And maybe if somebody wants me to talk about that later, I will. The other great thing I worked on at Boeing was the Phantom Ray X-45, which is that bottom right-hand corner. At the time I worked on it, 2009, 10, 11, it was the most sophisticated drone aircraft ever made. It was, and it still is. I mean, it's totally autonomous. It has powered by an F-18 engine. You can see those guys there. You can see how big it is, and it flew totally by itself. In fact, when we finished that program and they flew that, well, they had to get it to a test site, and the only test site for those kind of things is out at Edwards Air Force Base. And when they hired me in to work on the program, I was the data manager. So I was in charge of all of the documentation that the program put out. It all went through me. I had to make sure it was all readable. You know, I was working for a bunch of engineers that, you know, could barely write. So I had to make sure it was readable, grammatically correct. You know, it was all formatted right. And, you know, but when I got hired in, the manager said, well, look, you know, this was in Boeing Phantom Works. So if you know anything about Boeing Phantom Works, it's like the Skunk Works at Lockheed. And, you know, everybody has to do a lot of things. And everybody working in there, they're all the best folks. And so he told me, he goes, look, you got to do all this data management stuff, but I'm going to ask you to do other things that are, you know, just that we need to get done because we only have so many people. So one of the things, he called me in one day and he said, we got to figure out how to get this thing to the West Coast. You know, this thing is the size of a F-18, that you couldn't fly it, even though it was an autonomous aircraft. You can't fly that in airspace, you know, in civil airspace. So there were about 10 options. You know, we could have taken the wings off and put it in the Guppy, you know, the NASA Guppy, or taken it, you know, took down the Mississippi River, put it on a barge, taking it through the Panama Canal. We could have used a heavy lift helicopter and just hopped it, you know, about 50 hops, you know, across the country. I mean, there are a bunch of things, and I got the study to figure all that out. And I figured it out the next day. I was in the shower, and it came to me, we got to use the shuttle SCA for this. You know, this is a natural, you know, but of course, and I went and I told the boss next day, I go, look, I figured it out. You know, this is what we got to do. Contact NASA, get that big 747, which was a Boeing 747. I mean, this had Boeing written all over it. Well, he said, that's a great idea. Now do the trade study and eliminate logically all the other options. So if that's the only thing, so that's the only answer. And so, I don't know, it took about a month to do a deep dive, you know, did the trade study, went and briefed the head guy in Phantom Works. And, you know, he looked at it, smiled, laughed. He said, yeah, let's do it. So next thing I knew, I was down there at Ellington Air Force Base, meeting with all of these NASA top people on a way to use their 747, something they'd never thought of. But at the time, this is like the end of the shuttle program coming up. They were wanting somebody to give them alternative uses for the shuttle carrier aircraft. And this was perfect. So they said, yeah, let's do it. So anyway, so that's that's a longer story than I've told you, but this picture right here was one of the more interesting things. Working as the head of executive director of ShareSpace, I got a chance. Buzz and I did lots of crazy things. One of them was we went to the North Pole, and this is us. We were standing at the North Pole, and that's Fred McLaren, the human that has spent more time underneath the North Pole than in a submarine than any other human on the planet. So that was one of the neat things. And another neat thing, so at the very bottom there, in '87, I've been a member of NSS for years, since I was actually at the founding meeting. It's the first time I met Buzz Aldrin, but he didn't remember that one. But in 2017, you know, so I'm a member of the St. Louis Space Frontier Organization. In 2017, we had the ISDC here, and I was the ISDC program chair. Christine was the chair of everything because that's her rightful position in St. Louis. And more recently, I was the Region 4 director on the National L5 board. Okay, so now you got kind of an overview of my job life. And it all kind of happened since, you know, I was an intern at NASA. And I don't necessarily believe that all those things are responsible. I think it might have helped when I got that first job at Martin Marietta, you know, the fact that I'd worked for NASA. And I also worked on a couple of different shuttle simulations that I'll tell you about. So that might have helped. working on the shuttle. I worked for about 12 years on the shuttle, and then another couple of years putting up those payloads. All right, in a nutshell, and after you hear this page, you can leave if you want, because this is kind of the summary of what I'm going to talk about. So 17 years old, my first job in life. I'm a senior in high school. I went to Sunnyvale High School in the heart of Silicon Valley in Sunnyvale. So, and this is Silicon Valley in the 60s, late 60s. I graduated in 71. So this is when the Silicon Valley, this is the beginning of the boom. We had Intel and Hewlett Packard, and, all the big companies that you know of today, they all started there. And so when the internship happened, I'll get into exactly how I picked what I picked, but I ended up working at NASA, which was only about, NASA Ames was only about, 5 or 10 miles away from where I lived. I mean, it's at Moffett Field. For those of you that know California, it's located at Moffett Field, which is a big Navy base. And at the time, we watch airplanes fly in and out. It used to be P-3s primarily. And then the only loud airplane was this one that I'll be talking about, which people complained about. But all right, so I got this job at NASA Ames on it was called the Ames Vertical Gun range, which is a giant gun that shot projectiles into a target, and that's that target in the time frame that I was there, we were using to simulate the lunar surface and how to make craters. Now, one thing did I say? No, I didn't yet. But one of the things I was very into astronomy at a young age, and I was into photography, astrophotography. I had taken a number of pictures through my telescope, and I mean, in the old days, you had to develop them in a dark room and print them in a dark room, and had all these chemicals involved, and you had to, keep them in this chemical, go in the next chemical, and anyways, a long involved process to develop your film and then print it. And but I did that as a kid, 14, 15, 16. I was in charge of the photography on this Ames project. All right, and then by pure happenstance, the year that I worked there, 70, 71, that was the year the PIs that I worked for. It was only a small team, less than 10 people, but the two PIs, Don Galt and Bill Quaid, I didn't know it at the time, but they were giants in the planetary geology world. And I learned as soon as I got there, but they won the highest award within NASA for what they learned doing these lunar impacts. And as it turns out, that information came just in time to influence the selection of the Apollo 17 site. And it turns out Apollo 17 was the only Apollo landing that we actually knew the thickness of the lunar surface before we got there. And NASA was scared that the first landing, we didn't know if Apollo 11 was going to sink in dust and we'd never hear from those guys again. This was a big thing, back in the day. And then these guys figured out, how to know what the thickness is. So now, of course, NASA wanted to land in as thin regolith as possible. All right. And so I'll talk more about that coming up. And then actually, now this is like unrelated. A lot of, I went to Apollo 17 launch, with my friend Terry Turman. That's another story. Terry Turman and his wife and my girlfriend at the time, who was Elizabeth Ann Oppenheimer, who was related to Robert Oppenheimer. That's another real long story. But we went to Apollo 17 and we were about 8 miles away and saw the thing, and it was an amazing experience. It lit up the entire sky, this pea green color. And boy, if this was a fake moon landing, they went through a lot of trouble to fake that rocket launch for everybody. There were millions of people, of course, on the coast, watching this thing. At the time, of course, we didn't have the connections or the, to get in, to get really close. So I was with the millions of people out there, but it was quite a show. All right. So I can talk more about it. I'll talk more about any of these things later if people want. So just to let you know, and I touched upon some of this, my early interest really set the course for my life. I grew up in Silicon Valley in the 60s, as I mentioned. The youngest memory I have in life is my dad taking me outside on a corner. We had just moved from San Francisco to Sunnyvale, and I guess they bought a house, but it wasn't ready yet. So we were living in an apartment off El Camino Real in Sunnyvale. And my dad took me out and pointed up, and I saw Sputnik fly over. 4 years old, that's the earliest memory of my life. So that really had an impact on me. You know, I thought, God, that was cool. So that's when and then shortly thereafter, we started Mercury program and then Gemini and Apollo. So I got up and watched all of them. And it also, you know, caused an interest in astronomy. So when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, I bugged my dad for a couple of years. I bugged him, buy me a telescope, you know. So he ended up one day, went out, I guess I pissed him off enough, and he bought me this little 2 1/4 inch refractor, a Tasco refractor. And I'll never forget, we just got this telescope, and of course, I got sick. I was sicker than I had the flu or something as a kid. I was maybe 9, 10 years old. And so my dad said, well, I got to use this thing. So he took it out. And I remember looking out my front window at him on the driveway, and he's out there looking for something. I didn't know what. Next thing I know, he comes running. He goes, come here, you got to see this. You got to see this. And don't tell your mother, you know. So I snuck outside sicker than dog, and he had found Jupiter. And, you know, and it was just, you could see the moons, the 4 Galilean satellites and the bands. And it was just, whoa, in a little telescope. I was totally amazed. And then I had to get back inside. And then about 15, 20 minutes later, he comes running back in and goes, oh, you got to see this. You got to see this. Went outside, and he had Saturn in there in a 2 1/4 inch telescope. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The rings were clearly visible, and it was just, anyway, so I was into astronomy then. So that was my hobby as a kid. But then my dad, he knew I was into it, and this still blows me away to this very day. He bought me a large telescope. We joined the local astronomy club, you know, and eventually we ended up on the board, but we met all these incredible people in the astronomy club that helped make me, you know, into astronomy. But he bought me this big telescope up here on the nice picture of the lady standing next to it. It's a 12 1/2 inch f7 reflector. That was from Cave Optical Company. If any of you are astronomers or amateurs and know about telescopes, and if you're older, you'll know what this is. This was like at the time the best reasonably priced telescope in the world. That telescope in 1965 thereabouts cost $1,200. All right. And I don't know how my dad afforded it at the time. I mean, this boggles my brain because our whole house only cost $11,500 at the time. And as a side note, last week I went online, looked up my house in Sunnyvale, California that I grew up in, $1.8 million. Mind-boggling. But that's another story. Anyway, so my dad bought me this big telescope. So then I had to really get into it. So that's when I got into this astrophotography. I took all these pictures. You know, a lot of you will recognize a lot of this stuff. And if you're really good, you'll recognize that not all these things were taken through this telescope because some of these things are wide field things. And this only had a field about the size of a full moon. But yeah, so I, you know, got into photography. This picture right here of Andromeda was actually in Sky and Telescope magazine as a, I think I was in 6th grade. So that, and they made a big thing about this in my elementary school. You know, I had a display in the center of the school. Anyway, so I was into space since I was a kid. So that's, I think, an important thing for people to remember. And I really hope there's some teachers other than Christine listening, because teachers are so important. It was my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Simonek. I'll never forget that lady. She was the one that really got me into astronomy. And, you know, it was just teachers play such an important role. And we need more teachers supporting things like these internships, which I'll talk about now. So now all of a sudden I get to high school. When I got to high school, I kind of, you know, got out of the, you know, I just wasn't doing much astronomy anymore. Although I was doing some, I was like president of that astronomy club. And, you know, we met every month at a local college. I'll maybe touch upon that in a bit. But anyway, my high school, being in the heart of Silicon Valley, we were the first to teach computer programming. And at the time, I didn't realize how important it was. You know, really, I was a dumb kid. But I did take Fortran and BASIC, and that was a requirement to get into the NASA program. Okay, so anyway, so this opportunity comes up. You know, you had to, in order to get into a NASA internship, you had to have good grades. I had, you know, reasonably good grades. I had to have an interest in the subject matter, and I was obviously interested in everything they were doing at Ames. I had to have, and you had to have computer programming, which fortunately I'd taken it. I can't say I really liked it because I didn't really take much more. It was so tedious to me, you know? But you know, I took it. I was more into hands-on stuff, wood shop and that kind of stuff. Anyway, when I learned about this opportunity, they put a list in front of me of all the things. Once they said you're accepted in the program, they had a list about 3 pages long. I mean, there were 100 things to do at NASA Ames. I had no idea they did all those things at NASA Ames. I mean, if you were into anything, aeronautics, yeah, they had the world's largest wind tunnels over there. They were doing research. I'll never forget, there was a guy there named Dr. Cyril Panaparuma, who we had come and speak to our club many times. This guy was trying to recreate the early Earth and create the elements of life that life needed, you know, from you know, shooting a lightning bolt in it. And I mean, they were doing amazing things. Planetary sciences, they were analyzing all the lunar orbiter pictures and the stuff probes from Mars that I think we had one of the Mars probes that happened. You know, if you're in lunar geology, there's all kinds of stuff going on. Research in different environmental satellites. They were working all those kinds of things. And it went on and on. So I kind of, because of this photographic opportunity at this, they called it the Lunar Impact Lab, which I later learned was the Ames Vertical Gun. I chose that, you know, and this is a picture of it here. And you can see this is the way we used it. This big arm would swing down and we'd actually load the target into it, which was only just a few millimeters in size. And we moved the arm up, and it was, you know, it was like a gun. I mean, they put, they used, you know, gun. What do you call you know, what fires a gun into this thing, and they shoot it down into this chamber. And the chamber, they drew a vacuum in the chamber. The pedestal that the target sat on could actually fall right at the right instant to simulate lunar gravity, and we can create these craters, artificial craters. So that was kind of cool. So this is moving on. So there's a little bit about the gun, yeah, kind of. So I was in charge of the photography. So anyway, so as it says, and I got this fairly recently. I found this this write-up on the Ames Vertical Gun. I took these words out of it. Provides a celestial body impact simulation capability in support of the nation's research and development activities in the realm of high-speed impact physics. Well, that's cool, and that's what I thought they did when I got there. You know, to understand the physics and phenomena associated with crater formation. Cool, I was into that kind of thing. But what I didn't realize when I got there, the year I worked there, that program was pretty new. it had only been started a few years earlier with Apollo program money. They built this thing for Project Apollo. So as it turns out, even though I didn't realize it until recently, I was actually working on the Apollo program, because this is and probably getting paid for money out of that program. So that was my latest thing I've learned. Anyway, this thing would shoot projectiles, different speeds from 0.5 to 7 kilometers a second, and program projectiles up to 7.6 millimeters. I don't recall, I don't think ours were that big, but they're 2-3 millimeters in size bullets we were using, and so the high-speed imaging system was a 16 millimeter camera, high speed. So I know it was about 1,000 frames per second, and my job was to fill up the camera, make sure everything was plugged in right, and then a computer would trigger the camera at the exact right time when the projectile was impacting, because this all happened in a split second, of course. So you can see the target here on the right. That target is about 3 feet wide and about 6 or 8 inches deep. And now I couldn't find a picture of this, but when I was there, we had a guy named, his name was Tony Avarisi, I think, working in the lab in the back room. So if you look at this picture, where this guy is standing on the left side, there's a door right there behind him, and there's a lab back there. And this guy, Tony, would be back there making these targets. And these were precise targets. He'd put down a layer of white sand, a layer of red sand, a layer of blue sand, a layer of green sand. So he had all these layers of different colored sands, and about 8 inches. And then when they fired into this thing, they could see the colors, so they knew exactly what depths these sand particles had come from. So it was pretty amazing. All right, moving on. All right, so what did they discover? So basically what these guys discovered, they've been trying to find landing sites for the Apollo missions, and so we had Lunar Orbiter, and looking at this, so we had fairly high resolution lunar orbiter pictures to look at, and what they found was a similarity all over the moon of the different types of basic crater formation, and there were 4 basic types of geometries of craters under around 200, less than about 200 meters in diameter down to 20 meters. They saw a proliferation of the same 4 types of crater, and that's the normal geometry craters. Then you had the craters with the little central mound in the middle, or you had a flat bottom crater, or some craters had a kind of a dual geometry where there was a crater ring within a crater. And so what these guys noticed is we were able to duplicate these craters in the lab. We could they shot thousands of experiments in this gun, and they were able to duplicate the same types of craters. And we knew the thickness of the sand, and where the bottom, what substrate it would be the word on bedrock would be the word on the moon. Here it was just the metal bottom of the target. But we knew exactly the dimensions of all the dimensions involved in creating these craters in the lab, and they found a relationship between the diameter of the crater and the thickness and the thickness of the soil. And you have to go, basically if you, and there were different ratios involved. So if you divided if it turns out the thickness divided by the diameter is smaller than 4, then that's basically what it took for normal craters. And we knew, and if it was a bigger number, that's what the concentric ring crater was. And now for some of these middle ones, the flat bottom of the mound craters, it's a little more complex than that. And I didn't have enough room to put it on here, but there are ratios that they could use to tell exactly how thick the regolith is. And there are a bunch of other things they looked at. It didn't make much difference really, the change in velocity or of the projectile or the size. They were able to produce the same types of craters, or even the angles coming in. That made a little difference, but so anyway, Quaid and Galt wrote this paper, Thickness Determination of the Lunar Surface Layer from Lunar Impact Craters. And that came out, I think, the year before I got there. And but for some reason, well, I guess they'd already determined where they wanted to land on the moon, except they were still. So when I was there, I remember, and I'll touch upon this later. By happenstance, they had just had Apollo 14 when I just got there, because I accidentally met the crew of Apollo 14 walking out of the headquarters building. And then also on my next internship, they'd finished Apollo 15. So, you know, they were working on 15, 16, 17 when I was there. And I guess they figured out where they wanted to go with 15 and 16. But anyway, with this data, they were able to, this is just one more piece of information that went in to the site selection process. We weren't involved with, at least I wasn't. Now Quaid and, you know, Galt might, Quaid, Galt, and Overbeck, they might have been involved, but certainly not the 17-year-old high school student. Okay, so this basically sums up what they found out. So NASA did not want to land in high regolith thickness sites because they weren't too sure what was going to happen. They felt really glad that they didn't have problems on their first missions. So when they were looking at the sites for 17, you know, they went with the 4 millimeter thickness or 4 meter thickness soil. And as it turns out, only the Apollo 12 site was just slightly thinner. Of course, Apollo 12, they went to that site for another purpose. They wanted to land close to Surveyor so that they can, you know, prove they can do pinpoint landings. And also they wanted to bring back pieces of the Surveyor to see how they weathered, how it weathered in space. So they looked at they had over 1,500 craters, smaller than 250 meters in diameter, to analyze around the Apollo 17 landing site. So they had plenty of data, and they were very certain of the thickness of where they wanted to land. And of course, Apollo 17 was where they discovered the famous orange soil. So I like to think that I had a little something to do with the orange soil. Now, it wasn't much, but you know, I've always felt like, man, that's, you know, I had something to do with that. There's that famous shot of Harrison Schmitt next to a big rock. Anyway, this is a picture of the broader picture of Taurus Littrow. You can see they landed right in the middle of those mountains, but we don't need to spend much time there. All right, so this is in summary, looking at the regolith, thickness of all the sites. So Apollo 11, 4.4 meters of dust. So you could see from this that only Apollo 12 was 3.7 meters, so slightly less than Apollo 17. Now, Apollo 16, Descartes Highlands, you know, they actually landed in some pretty thick dust, you know, over 12 meters. I think that's the one where they're kind of cocked at an angle. So on average, median regolith thickness in the Maria region is typically 2 to 4 meters. And in the highlands, non-Maria regions, typically 6 to 10 meters. So that's, you know, that's what we learned actually post all this. Because once we knew the trick, we can go through and analyze the whole moon. And now, whenever we go back to the moon, we'll know exactly how thick things are. And if you want to mine that regolith, and we have reasons to mine regolith, we may want to go to a thicker, place, but that's a story for another time. Okay, so that would normally be the end, and so I'll try to speed this up. A few things have happened lately. I did mention briefly, I was walking into NASA headquarters building, which is right close to the Impact Lab. Anyway, these guys walk out of, 3 guys walk out of there, and they're walking towards me. And I look, I go, you guys are the crew of Apollo 14. And I said, yeah. This was towards the end of my time, my first year, because I knew I was about to leave the program. So I had been out, I had to find another job. So they just opened up a hamburger joint next to my house. It was called Herfy's. I remember that well. I went in there, the day before, and they gave me an application, and which I filled out, and I was going to go, drop it off. And so I met these 4 astronauts, and I didn't have anything. I wanted their autographs. They didn't have anything. I didn't have anything to write on except my filled out application for Herfy's hamburgers. So they ended up signing the back of my application. And when I went in a day or 2 later, I told the guy I'd have to fill out another one because I wanted to keep this one. And he understood. I also have some interesting stories meeting Ron Evans. I met Ron Evans with Paul Fisher from Fisher Space Pen at the STS-1 launch. And that turned into something really great for me, and for Fisher Space Pen, because Ron took this the Fisher Space Pen had just come out with their little bullet pen. And Ron took it, he goes, this would be great if it had a clip on it, and it would fit right here in our flight uniforms. And Mr. Fisher said, oh, that's a good idea. He went home, developed a clip for the Fisher Space Pen. And I had introduced Mr. Fisher to a bunch of other folks, luminaries that were at the first shuttle launch. And he ended up offering me a job. I had the ultimate job for space activists. Mr. Fisher always had $1 million in his checking account. And he goes, Ron, I want to give it away to groups that could use this money. And he goes, but I don't know. And he goes, you do. Would you kindly, take on the responsibility of giving money away to people you think are in need in the space community? So anyway, for a while, I was very popular with the space community. I gave, I gave 2 and 5. I gave mostly $2,000 checks away to National Space Society, Planetary Society, different groups. I got to know Bob Zubrin fairly well during the Space Exploration Initiative days, and he had he was talking about, he formed the Mars Society, but they'd never had a conference. So I gave Bob $5,000 for his first conference in Boulder. Yeah. And the rest is history. Look, if you ever go to his conferences, they're probably amongst the best. Let's see. So Gene Cernan, because I worked so closely with Buzz Aldrin for so many years, I met almost all the Apollo astronauts and most of the other ones. And when we were in DC, we needed to get the DC guys smart on space tourism. I was there in the late 90s, early 2000. We wanted to fly tourists in space. And so we had we, meaning myself and Buzz with ShareSpace, choreographed. Key committee in Congress gets together and you brief them. You bring all these people in front, and tell them where they should be spending their money. So we had one, a congressional committee meeting on the future of NASA. And so Buzz and this meeting was actually in the Smithsonian, the first and only congressional committee ever held in the Smithsonian Institution. And we did it in front of we had the lunar limb, and we brought in Ron Howard and Apollo 17 crew, you know, Cernan and Ron Story, Musgrave, a bunch of guys, and experts in the area of long-range visionary space stuff. That was great. And then a few years later, we teamed up with Space Adventures. Buzz was on their advisory committee, and we briefed Congress on the importance of space tourism and getting that going. So that laid the foundation of Tennis Tito and the following, you know, space tourism flights. So those are really great time. And anyway, we had Cernan come to one of those meetings in the history of NASA, and you know, he has a ranch. I forget, it was in Utah or something, but he was putting you know, horses on a horse, but the horse bolted and kicked him right in the face. And so he had this big, he was all black and blue in here, you know, but he said, I'm talking to Congress, you know, he didn't care how he looked. He was a tough guy. So that's an interesting story. Anyway, and then there was the ISDC. So we had the ISDC, we had lots of great people come to St. Louis in 2017. And one of them was this guy, Gerstemeyer, Bill Gerstemeyer, who was formerly head of the station program, head of the shuttle program, Shuttle Near, head of the Office of Exploration at NASA. And you know, he was like pretty high up on the chain at NASA. So I had lunch with him a couple of times, and I told him this story. This happened, it blew me away. Many years after I left NASA, I was, you know, living in I don't even know where I was living, but I was visiting home in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they had, you know, there were obviously a lot of changes at NASA, and my friend that I was staying with said, "Oh, let's go check out the new gift shop at NASA," which was outside the gate. And that's this big white building on top. If you ever go to NASA Ames, driving into it on the right side, you'll see this big, this used to be just a parking lot, but now it's a parking lot with a gift shop on it. Anyway, we went in there and looked around, and it was kind of neat. They had a space station module mock-up. You know, they had a couple of satellites and an old Mercury capsule, but it was a gift store. They were selling, you know, they were selling freeze-dried ice cream and shirts and hats and little robots and all kinds of stuff you'd expect to see at a gift store. So I went to buy something, and I'm at the counter to buy something, and I'm talking to this young guy behind the counter as he's ringing me up. He happened to mention that, you know, this is part of his internship. I go, "What? You're a NASA intern?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I'm thinking about my experience as a NASA intern, which you've only heard half of it so far. And this guy was working in a gift shop behind a counter, working a cash register. But I just wanted to tell that story. Okay, so now, all right, so I graduate from high school. I went to a community college right nearby in Cupertino, 2-year college, part of the Foothill Community College District. And I get there, and my astronomy club, which I've talked about a little bit, was, you know, actually met every month at the other college in the community college district called Foothill. And they had a little planetarium there. And this one day, our club was meeting we were going to have a planetarium show. Okay. So, you know, when you go to a planetarium, they keep the doors closed, and they bring everybody into a small room, and you're standing up, you're waiting, it's packed, you know, before they open the doors to go in and sit down. Well, we're standing in this little room, and there's about 50 people. We're like packed. I mean, you know, there's like no room. We're packed, and everybody's talking, and it's loud. And so I don't remember who I was talking to, but I do remember there's a guy immediately behind me, his back to my back, And I could hear him talking to whoever he was talking to. And I heard him say he was from NASA and he was here looking for a student with an astronomy background for an internship out at NASA Ames. And whoever I was talking to, I said, "Oh, excuse me, hold on a minute." And I turned around and I looked at this guy. I said, "I heard what you told him. I'm your guy. I want the job." So the next day I was down. I had a meeting with the head director of the Airborne Sciences Directorate at NASA Ames, and he explained to me the program, and I was just dumbfounded. I talked about myself. Anyway, he offered me the job on the spot. You got the job. So now I'm entering junior college in their internship program, and we got minimum wage and college credit. So there I was, 1972. Now I'm working as an intern on in a different area. Went from planetary research to astronomy, and part of this job, it did require an observational astronomy background. And I showed you that huge telescope I had since I was 12 years old. I had an observational astronomy background. So my first job they gave me was to be the custodian of this 12-inch telescope. Now, I grew up, a big telescope was a 12.5-inch telescope. Well, they had a 12-inch telescope in a Lear jet that they used to do infrared research. Because I had experience with telescopes, they said, "This is yours. You work with the investigators coming in, take care of any issues on the telescope." Well, this telescope in this Lear jet it was historic. This is the telescope that they first discovered that Jupiter and Saturn emitted more radiation than fell on them from the sun. That was a big discovery way back, in the early 70s. And they also, with this telescope, actually discovered that it was huge amounts of sulfuric acid in the clouds of Venus. We didn't know. We thought the clouds of Venus were just regular clouds, but this little telescope said differently. And then now, just a side note, when I was at Vandenberg a few years after this, I don't know how many years actually, but I was working on a shuttle at Vandenberg. I had a girlfriend. I went to Washington, D.C., me and my girlfriend, and we were going through the Smithsonian Institution. And I had no idea, but we turned the corner and there was that telescope that I worked on in the Smithsonian Institution. So that was really exciting. That's a little side note, and if you want to make points with a girlfriend, let me tell you, that'll work. Anyway, I also worked on another, see on the bottom right-hand picture. So these pictures, this is the Lear jet that the telescope was in. And here's the telescope, and here's all the instruments that run it. And here's the telescope from the inside. It's a very short Dahl-Kirkham telescope. We don't have time to go into that stuff. All these windows back here, and there's more windows over here. These are the offices in the hangar that we worked in. And they had a big CV-990, which was like a 707 airplane. And now the Kuiper Airborne Observatory, I also worked on that. And they built a separate hangar for that. That was so big. But there were all kinds there was a U-2 in this hangar. And the world's first vertical liftoff. They've developed all that vertical liftoff technology at NASA Ames. Airplane was in this hangar. Anyway, the CV-990, I supported also until one day it crashed, and that's an incredible story. It crashed upon landing, coming in to land at Moffett, crashed in the golf course across the street, Sunnyvale Golf Course, and of course, I was in the office that morning, and I told the boss's secretary that I was going to go get on that airplane just to take pictures, because they just changed out an engine. They're just fly around the Bay Area It was a beautiful day. And anyway, there was an error in the flight control tower. They'd actually told another airplane, there were two airplanes coming in to land at the same time. There were one airplane little in front of the 990, and the control tower guy called out the wrong tail numbers to descend. And long story short, the 990 clipped, somehow they appeared at the same spot together and collided and crashed in the golf course. It was just a huge, horrible thing. I think there were like, I think 16 people, I think, died. And at the last minute, I was working on one of these projects I'll touch upon in a minute. I decided I don't have time to do this. So I stayed in my office. And sitting in the office, I remember people running down the hallway, like a bunch of people. And my roommate, his name was Jim, I go, wonder what's going on. So we went outside and one of the guys said, 990 crashed. It was right across the street. So I said, oh, let's get over there. So I immediately went over there, see if we can do anything. And so I was gone. I was over there at the site. And unfortunately, I totally forgotten that I had told the secretary that I was going to be on the airplane. So my girlfriend, Elizabeth Ann Oppenheimer, calls up and says, is he okay? And they said, we don't know. He said he was going to be on the airplane, and he doesn't respond to his calls. So 2 or 3 hours later, I go back and I walk into the office, and everybody was standing around like, pretty grim. I mean, we just lost a lot of people from our office. And I walked in, and they go, "Ron, you're alive!" Everybody's hugging me, and I go, "Yeah." And I'd forgotten that I said I was probably going to just go on that flight. And anyway, my boss goes, "You better call the girlfriend. She thinks you're on it." So I can go on about that, but okay. So moving on. I mean, this whole experience, just so many extraordinary experiences. One of the first assignments they give me is to work with this guy named Carl Hanais. Now, I don't know if you guys know who Carl Hanais is, but he actually he was an astronaut that hadn't flown, and he was an astronomer. And at the time, we were gearing up for shuttle simulations. So Carl was pulling together, actually the very first ASSES mission. ASSES stood for Airborne Science Shuttle Experiment System Simulation. And what they did is they used the Learjet, which I was working on, and they used that as part of the simulation, where they set up some trailers right off of the runway, and they were trying to answer the question, can you really do research from space? Can we use the shuttle to do significant research? Because this is many years, 10 years before the shuttle flew. Anyway, so we set up all these trailers and brought in desks and chairs, communications. And what he did was he'd fly, he'd go up with the pilot. He worked in the back end with the telescope and take data and land. They pulled the airplane right up to the close to the trailer entrance. Hop out of the trailer, hop out of the airplane, go right in the trailer. He'd analyze his data and take care of anything he needed to take care of. They're trying to simulate a 2-week mission as best they could on the ground, collect real data, and yeah, it was a great experience being part of this early mission. Now, Carl was really into bubbles in the sky. He was an astronomer into galactic bubbles, and I think today he's got a number of these galactic bubbles named after him. He did eventually fly in the shuttle, and he flew in a Space Lab mission. And there was a second ASSES simulation mission, which used the Convair 990 this is the one that they bought another one after the one crashed. They bought another one and used that to simulate working in the shuttle. So yeah, and then he got to do this. The instrument that he developed there at NASA Ames, he actually took on board in the space lab in space and flew a couple of weeks. So all that stuff was done, years ahead of time, planning these things out. And of course, he later died in '93 testing some instruments that he wanted to fly in space on tissue regeneration. He died on Mount Everest, climbing up Mount Everest. Anyway, one other thing, while I was there, somehow I met this Dr. Patricia Cowings, and I don't know if many of you know her. I think she's still there. She's a psychologist, NASA psychologist. Astronauts did not like to speak to her. They didn't like somebody playing with their psyche. But she was doing research in motion sickness and trying to control motion sickness was a big problem with astronauts. And so she was trying to use biofeedback to control the onset of the symptoms of motion sickness. So I forget how I got involved in this, but I was part of one of her study groups. And they put you in this chair, like see this guy here, and they spin this chair, different speed. They slowly get it going faster and faster and faster. And you moved your head left and right and left and right. It was there because they were trying to stimulate the vestibular system. And when you spin, and you go left and right and you're spinning, that's what screws you up and you get motion sick. And so they had little electrodes all over my body. They were looking at every single kind of they were looking at a lot of different things. So they knew exactly when I was about to get sick, and they always stop you right before you barfed your guts out. And so the important thing here is one day I went in there. You went in, I think about 2 or 3 times a week, and did the thing. Well, one day I'm going around in the chair and I'm moving my head, and she keeps going faster. I'm moving my head and faster and faster and faster, and then all of a sudden she stops. She goes, "Okay, you've been taking some drugs. You've been doing any drugs?" I said, "No." She goes, "Well, something's going on here. You're going faster than you've ever gone before, and you're not showing any signs of motion sickness." And so we went over my history of the last few days. Turns out the day before, I went over my parents' house. I have since moved out. I got an apartment. My mother had cats. I'm allergic to cats. So whenever I go over there, I take, in the old days, they used to have something called Allerest and Sudafed. Well, I took one of each, because I was just, so I had Allerest and Sudafed in my system. Turns out, as we come to find out, Allerest and Sudafed, they combined in the stomach to make a fantastic motion sickness drug. So if you ever want to, so she documented all this in her report, and so I was only a single point, in her research, but an important point. So if you guys are ever out there, you're worried about getting motion sickness, take some Allerest and Sudafed, and that's all I have to say about that. Okay, so now one of the other things I did when I worked for supporting all the directorates, so we're waiting for the big C-141 to come in. It's out, it's the big observatory, 36-inch telescope. It's out being outfitted now with this telescope out in Texas. In the meantime, they're just finding things for me to do. And so they had, apparently there were some issues that came up. We'd fly these, whenever we flew these telescopes, the 990 or the Learjet, they always flew at night, to do research on stars or the atmosphere. The 990 was mostly scoped out with instruments that looked out the sides and up the top of the aircraft, measuring the constituents in the atmosphere. They flew that one in the day and the night. But they had a problem. Every once in a while, something would go wrong, and they needed somebody while they were out, in flight, to take care of issues that came up. If somebody got sick on board, they needed an ambulance to be there when they landed, or if equipment broke down and they needed something there to, a chiller or something, whatever the need was. They needed somebody there to know what was going on and make sure things were taken care of when they landed. So here I am, like 19 years old, and I'm in the control room for all these airplanes to 2, 3, 4 in the morning, just listening to the radio, taking note of anything that came up. And I guess at some point they said, maybe we shouldn't have an intern doing this. So this was about the time Apollo 15 had just happened. And Al Worden, as it turns out, had 2 years to go on his, to get 30 years in, I guess. And so he needed to go, he left the astronaut program. Al Worden, of course, Apollo 15 command module pilot. So he came out to Ames, and one day my boss calls me into the office. He goes, "Hey, Ron, I'd like you to meet somebody." And it was Al Worden. I recognized him. And so that was pretty exciting for a young kid meeting Al Worden. And the boss goes, "Hey, he explained to me the situation. Al's going to be working out here for a while, and we'd like him to take over the duties of handling the flights at night, and you help him. Great. Work with Al Worden." And so 2 or 3 times a week we'd be up all night, from 8, 9, 10 to sometimes 2, 3, 4 in the morning, with nothing to do but talk. So one day the topic of UFOs came up, and I said, "Al, did you ever see a UFO?" And he said, and I'll never forget what he said. He says, "Well, yes." I go, "Oh, tell me about it." He goes, "Well, do you want the real story or the NASA story?" So I said, "I want both." So he proceeded to tell me this story of after they'd entered trans-lunar injection on their way to the moon. One of them looked out the window, and they saw this object out the window, and it was bigger than a star. It was kind of like a glowing disc, and it was. They could tell it was following alongside of them because they could see stars behind it moving along with the spacecraft on the way to the moon. And there's a lot to the story, but as it turns out, when they finished up at the moon and were coming back to Earth, same thing showed up, followed them almost all the way back to Earth. So needless to say, I don't know if I was impressionable, but I think it was important to have somebody like an astronaut tell me that, yeah, there was UFOs. Something followed him to the moon. Now, when they got back, they were debriefed by NASA, and NASA told them right up front, "You're not to talk about this to anybody. This never happened. Just don't talk about it." So I was kind of, he told me that. So anyway, that affected me, so for my whole rest of my life, I followed what was happening in the UFO community and the whole metaphysical community. I've got a lot of spiritual stories, that we don't have time for here, but growing up, similar type of experiences. But this story didn't really hit home until many years later, 19 years later, when I started working with Buzz Aldrin. It turned out he and I just lived down the coast from me, and I spent a lot of time at his house. And we'd go, he lived right on Laguna Beach, and we'd end up down on the beach drinking Diet Coke. It's all he drank it back then was Diet Coke. So we talked about space stuff all the time. One day, the topic of UFOs came up, and he proceeded. I asked him, "Have you ever seen a UFO?" Well, at the time he was writing a book. Actually, this was when he was writing Tau Zero. And I asked him, UFOs, you ever seen one? He goes, well, yes, I did. I said, well, do tell, you know. And he proceeded to tell me a story about right after translunar injection, a couple of days out, he looked out the window and he saw something, this small luminous, you know, orange colored thing that was slightly bigger in diameter than a star. And he could see that it was traveling with them because he could see the stars moving in the background. And he said this thing followed him all the way to the moon. And people will know that, you know, that there was a point where Neil Armstrong radioed back. Yeah, they turned off the communications, and they caucused. And they said, well, what the hell is this? And they all agreed that they can't, you know, they didn't want anything to take, this is the first moon landing. They didn't want anything to take away from that. They couldn't tell NASA that they're being followed by a UFO. So there are only three logical things that it could be. And when it through their mind, it could either be the stage that sent them out there, the S4B stage, or it could be the panels that covered the limb, the conical panels that they shot off, that went off, you know, spinning, or, you know, those are the only two logical things it could be, or maybe something else, which is obviously something unidentified. So anyway, they did at one point turn on the communications, asked Houston where the S4B stage was. And Houston said, hey, S4B stage is about 10,000 miles behind you now. So they knew it wasn't that. And they knew it wasn't the conical, the fairing around the limb, because that would have a light signature that would go up and down, up and down, up and down. Because you know, it was outside was white reflective aluminum, inside was flat black painted cork. So, and they're tumbling. So it would definitely show a tumbling, you know, signature. This was just a continuous glowing thing. Anyway, so I told Buzz about the discussion I had with Al Ward. He'd never heard it. They never talked, you know, those guys never talked to one another. There's still a lot of competition between them, and they never briefed on you know, talked about UFOs. Now, there's a lot of stories about, you know, but a lot of people have asked Buzz about UFOs, and he's had about 3 or 4 different stories that he's told over the years. There's only one that's really accurate, you know, and it's if he wants to talk about it or not. And all right, so anyway, if anybody wants to know more about this link down here is a YouTube. I don't think we need to go into it now, but that link, I went public with my story, because from my knowledge, you know, I'm the only guy that I know, you know, probably in the world, that actually talked to 2 astronauts, 2 different missions, that reported seeing the same thing on their way to the moon. But Al wanted to keep it. He didn't want to talk about it, and there's quite a story. I had told people in Washington, D.C., and people on the Hill, and I didn't realize that there was a clique of people that work UFO issues, and they had told a movie producer. And so for years I was bugged by this movie producer to do a documentary on this. Well, I mean, we had a vice president of Discovery, I think it was Discovery Channel, had money ready to go with the documentary. But I had to get, Buzz was ready to talk, but I had to get a hold of Al Warden. So I reestablished communication with Al Warden after about 20 years. Say, hey, Al, you may not remember me. I'm the young kid you worked with way back in the day at Ames Research Center. Anyway, I went through the whole story, and he didn't want to talk about it. So deference to him, you know, he decided to take it to, he didn't quite take it to his grave. I think, you know, he recently died, and right before he died, he came out with the information. And so in 2017, 2018, it was the ISDC after ours in St. Louis. It was in Los Angeles. And right after that, there was a big UFO conference in Palm Springs, not far from LA. So I went there to find a few people and tell them the story. And I found them. And my story is in this YouTube link if anybody wants to go do some more research. Anyway, just to show you the significance of these internships and the time frame that I was working my college internship. This was the Nixon era, and way back in this time frame, President Nixon had put on a big hiring freeze, wage and price controls. You know, it was an interesting time to be in the United States, and what that meant to NASA is they couldn't hire anybody. And at the same time, maybe a few months earlier, they discovered Comet Kahutek. And early sightings of this thing, early analysis said this is going to be a huge comet. You know, we got to study it. Well, we have Skylab up there in the Skylab telescope. And so NASA put on this big crash program to study Skylab. And it was an ultraviolet telescope in the Skylab. And they wanted to study it from the air in the Kuiper Airborne Observatory in the infrared, because it's an infrared telescope. Unfortunately, in order to do this, on the Kuiper program, we had to push the schedule up 6 months. We had to get the airplane ready to fly 6 months earlier than was currently planned. Now that's a huge undertaking. And another problem, the telescope, we had the telescope now mounted in telescope mounted in the airplane. We were doing checkouts of it, you know, out on the ramp at night, making sure everything worked. Except the secondary mirror was the one that came with it, was like a regular secondary mirror for a regular telescope. Well, in infrared telescopes, you got to have something different. You got to have a mirror that actually wobbles back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back. And because for one instant, you want to be looking at the black cosmic background, which we know the temperature of. And then the next instant, you want to be looking at whatever target you're measuring, and you compare them constantly, back and forth, back and forth. And you're doing a raster scan over this target. So you're getting a look at it at whatever wavelength you're looking at it in. But you know the actual infrared brightness of the target. Now, in the infrared, you're measuring temperatures, very, very low temperatures, in 50, 100 degrees, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, we're looking at the temperature of clouds, basically in space. Okay, but we didn't have a secondary mirror that, you know, so the boss calls me into the office again one day, and I'm sitting down with the senior chief designer. Guy's name was Joe DeRose, I'll never forget. And boss said, well, hey, we got to come up with the secondary mirror. We got to do it fast. And, you know, we got to get this thing ready to fly. And he goes, I want you two guys to work on it. And he goes, Ron, come up with an alternative concept. No, alternative concept. Why don't you know? He just wanted two different concepts to look at. And I said, okay. So I went home, and I thought a lot about it. And then one night, and I will cover this later, but I actually had a dream of how this thing should look. And I went in the next day, I started drawing it out. I never told anybody about the dream part, I don't think. I started drawing it out, the concept, and you know, I did a nice, we didn't have PowerPoint, I don't know what it was, but I put together a nice presentation of what I thought we could do. And then we had a big, like a a meeting, an assessment of the approaches. And Joe DeRose had a fairly traditional approach to doing what it had to do. And lo and behold, there were a number of people that kind of reviewed the concepts, and they chose mine. And this, think about it, 19 years old, I don't know anything about anything. And, they choose me to build. So I had to, do it. I conceived it, had to design it, had to get it fly, had to build it and get it in the telescope and working all in record time. Well, first problem, I'm out of high school now, right? I'm in college. I hadn't taken any drafting classes. So this thing had to be designed. And I was going to take a drafting class, but I didn't. So next thing I knew, a couple of days later, boss calls me into the office again. He goes, he introduces me to this young kid, a high school intern. He goes, Ron, this guy knows drafting. He's taken like 3 drafting classes. So I think I became the world's first intern with an intern. And I sat down with him and we went over, I explained the thing and he started drawing it up. And of course, the boss is all looking over our shoulder, and we finally got it to where it looked good. And then I had to go get it made. So we went over to the boss, calls me into the office again, and says, you'll be working with this machinist over in the big machine shop. And there were a couple of guys actually. And so, for, I don't know, a couple of months we worked as they cut this thing out. You can see what it finally looked like there in the bottom picture. So yeah, we got the thing finished, and it, the 36-inch telescope in the C-141 was the biggest airborne telescope in the world. So this is really kind of a thrill for me to do this. Yeah, I mentioned that it came to me in a dream. Now the last thing is, the first thing I had to do was, the only thing I had to look at was this little 12-inch telescope that in the Learjet. And it turns out the guy that did that set of drawings, so I can go study the drawings, he was in another building, and it was a guy named Alan Bakke. And I don't know if you got to be probably older, like our age. Joe, have you always been in California?
Yep. Well, you and I have actually, it's amazing. I've been listening to your story. I live in Laguna Beach. I tried to get a job at Vandenberg on the space shuttle. We have lots of things to talk about later.
All right. Well, you might have heard of Alan Bakke then, because back in this time frame, he had a major legal battle in the Supreme Court, and it was big news in California.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah,
yes.
This guy was it was an affirmative action suit. He had been denied entrance in the UC California. It was either Berkeley or I forget which. I think it was Berkeley, in wherever the med school is. And he'd had straight A grades, and he'd been denied 3 times because of affirmative action. They chose people with lower grades that were of a different ethnic background. So Alan did the original drawings. So I got a chance to meet with him. Anyway, a little bit about the Kuiper. It's a C-141. There's a look inside at the beginning. My little camp where I sat was up here right next to the telescope. And this is the telescope up here in the upper right before it was put in to the airplane, obviously. Anyway, it's a bent Cassegrain system. This is the secondary mirror that we rebuilt. That's the old one. Anyway, light would come in, bounce off the main mirror, bounce off the secondary mirror, and there was another mirror in the middle here, and it would send a tertiary mirror. It would send the light through an air bearing. It was the world's largest air bearing, and into we'd have the instruments set up over here. and it would track. And we used leftover Skylab gyros, a couple of them on this telescope, and they kept the telescope pointed in the right position. And you can, when you're sitting there, when the airplane was in flight, the airplane to go would wings would go up and down, but the instrument would stay still. And you can see the airplane move around it and fly. It was kind of amazing. Anyway, so yeah, it's a little bit about the telescope and the airplane. Now, this is the instrument that I conceived this in a dream. We built it. It was a cone within a cone, and yeah, you got to worry about a lot of things because this thing is exposed to the outside temperature. There's a big hole at the side of the airplane, and it's like minus 68, minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's freezing out there. So metals contract. So you had to choose your metals with the right coefficient of expansion, and in order to make it do. This thing had to move in and out to focus. It had to rotate. Your beam, your wobbles, it had to be able to rotate, and it had to wobble back and forth. The whole mirror, the mirror mounted right up here. If you see this, and so it went in and out to focus. So that was, and then there were two solenoids on each side of the mirror over here. If you can see that, these are solenoids, and those things would go 10, 20, 30 times a second. You need to be able to vary the speed of the wobble, and also the size of the wobble too. I forgot that. If you want to just move really just a little bit or move a lot. Anyway, that was it, and it was on there for a couple of years. I'm sure they put something. Then they invented something called cobalt samarium magnets shortly thereafter, and so they developed a secondary with those in. Anyway, that program ended in '73, and I ended up going to work because I'm still working on the secondary mirror, and you can see in the telescope where it was mounted up here. So I went to work for a NASA contractor as a technician on board the airplane, and here I am working in front of my council. And we had television cameras on the low light level television cameras. The best of the time, they were called ISET. So I could see through a smaller scope and the big scope, and we controlled it all from that board. And I actually found the targets to look at and lock the telescope on a target. Here's one of our early flights. That's Donna Awishi and Carl Gillespie, who was a pioneer in early infrared astronomy. In fact, everybody I worked with was a pioneer. It was just amazing. Anyway, we did the first a lot of missions, hundreds of hours of time in flight. We did one of the neater ones was we went to Hickam Air Force Base and worked out of Hawaii, and because we had to get there, because we only had a certain elevation that we could look at the side, look out the side of the telescope. We had to get down closer, a little closer to the equator to see the galactic center. And this is what the galactic center looked like. You can't really see much in the visible, but we did the first high resolution infrared studies of the galactic center. And it was from those studies that these guys figured, there's got to be a black hole here. So it was this research that suggested the first black hole in the center of our galaxy. So now, I know we're running out of time. This is the last significant slide. There were so many memorable flights, I was on a flight where they actually discovered water vapor in Jupiter's atmosphere, which was a very big discovery as far as our understanding of the formation of the solar system. That was a pretty exciting night. And we discovered the evidence of the black hole in the center of the galaxy. I made the first observations of Saturn in broad daylight. We were up daytime flight, checking the system out. And we wondered, well, can we find anything in the daylight? And we knew where Saturn was, so that was pretty remarkable. I was on Ed Nye's disastrous last flight now, and then the last CV990 flight. Yeah, I already talked about the crash of that. And on Ed Nye's flight, that was another crash. We were up over the Olympic Peninsula, turning right along the Canadian border, when all of a sudden, through our headsets, you had to wear headsets. It was very loud in the back end of a cargo ship. Yeah, we were listening. We heard this beep, 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 and it turns out another C-141 identical to ours, with 16 people in it, identical to ours, crashed into a mountain. And what we heard was the beacon going off. And Ed Nye, who was the father of infrared astronomy, was so shook up by it. Everybody was shook up. He just refused to fly again in an airplane. So what can you say? Met a lot of famous people. Worked with Charlie Towns for a couple of years. He invented the laser, and he was also an infrared astronomer. So got to know him. Ed Nye, Frank Lowe, and Carl Gillespie were two big pioneers. Lowe invented the gallium arsenide bolometer, germanium bolometer, and he was the guy that discovered that Jupiter and Saturn emit, more energy in Learjet. Carl Gillespie was the first guy to actually use a chopping secondary mirror in the telescope. Martin Harwood, famous infrared spectroscopy guy. Jim Elliott, Jim's a great guy. He was the guy. I had just left the program when they discovered the rings of Uranus on my birthday. Very disappointed. Dr. Pico. Anyway, all these are just fantastic people, fantastic experiences. And I just can't overstate the importance of these NASA internships. All right, well, I'm basically finished. I could talk more about discoveries that were made on the Kuiper.
Right,
but
we're now into 2 hours, so I think if we're going to have any kind of Q&A, if you don't mind, I think we should probably move into that segment.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. And and folks, thank you for staying with us. I did write in the chat window that this is being taped, our videotape, so we will, and that will be on YouTube channels, the NSS YouTube channel and the SAC L5 YouTube channel after I've edited it a bit. Anyway, we have several questions. So first question for Ron from Tracy Henry. My daughter loves space and wants to work for NASA. She is majoring in physics now. She's a freshman. Do you have any education or instruction recommendations for her? For example, should she focus on certain types of classes? Some have said having experience in business is helpful. After 50 years of working in the industry, what would you recommend for her? Thank you.
Well, if she wants to work for NASA, she's majoring in the right thing. It sounds like physics. It depends on what she wants to do. You can get a business degree, become an accountant at NASA. It depends on what she wants to do. I'd suggest to be involved in these exciting type things. It's probably best to have a science, or a medical background, biomedical, physics, and if she could add physics and biology together, that's in big demand now as we continue to move out into space. And you just tell her to keep doing what she's doing. Develop it. Keep developing those interests, and it might be wise to find a specialty, whatever she loves the most. Either in physics, chemistry, and kind of focus somewhere where she can be speak with some authority. And also, don't think she's going to get a job right out of the starting gate at NASA unless she's an intern and proves herself. I was lucky. Most interns, once their internship is over, they're out. And but I got hired by a contractor to continue work on what I was working on. That's like very rare. All right, but still, if she can establish herself at NASA like in an internship, that's would be a fantastic thing to do. Now, I was
Great.
lucky. NASA Ames was right at my back door. There's only so many NASA centers around the country, and so I don't know where you live, but that may or may not be feasible.
Right.
But that's what I'd suggest. Be willing to take a job like at a Boeing or wherever to get some experience. NASA likes people with experience and people that excel in something.
Okay, so then the next question is from David Chivrant, I believe it's pronounced. What is known
Hey.
about the material properties or conditions that are deeper than the thickness of the dust on the lunar surface?
Well, well, all we knew at the time was that it was like lava, a bedrock, and that's another reason to study these craters. And one thing we'll be studying when we get back is, these impacts throw up, some of this bedrock, and so we'll be doing a lot more study of that kind of stuff. But they're, lava flows primarily. And of course, when we get back, we're going to want to be extracting lots of things from the regolith, like oxygen and hydrogen, water, and also metals, aluminum and iron. And there's a lot of oxygen tied up, and silicates in the regolith. So we're going to be, I suspect, looking at a lot of that stuff, with some early NASA probes coming up here in the very near future. But yeah, other than lava, I can't tell you, Dave, and it's good to hear from you.
Well, there was a comment from Dennis Pearson. He said, Alan Shepard's daughter went up to space in Bezos's new Shepard rocket for a suborbital flight, effectively duplicating her father's historic American trip in 1961.
She didn't do that yet, did she? I think she's.
Pardon me?
Did that already happen? I thought it was like in the next week or two.
Oh, really? He says he says she went up, but maybe it's just scheduled to happen.
She's picked to go up on the next one. I don't think it has happened yet, but the last few days I've been kind of busy, so maybe it happened and I missed it.
It looks like I'm not sure. This is from Christine Noby or not. Mike and Christine, is this picture from you?
Yeah,
I'm going to share
the
screen.
picture is from me.
I'm going to share it on the screen here.
Yeah, Michael
Here's-
was mentioned in the question and answer part of the.
Here's the picture. You should be able to see that picture.
Yeah.
And the question is that the one you were talking about, I guess?
So Michael made a comment about Gene Cernan looking like a coal miner, the picture where he looks like a coal miner. And so I found
so this has got to be that's on the moon and they're covered with filth. So yeah, that looks like it would be it.
Michael asked it in that question and answer feature, but I answered in the chat because I don't know.
I got it.
Yes.
So there's the picture.
It's a dirty job. Walking on the moon is a dirty job.
A dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
Did you ever see a UFO? Somebody asked. Eric Paquin asked that, Ron. Did you personally ever see a UFO?
Well, I spent thousands of hours out on mountaintops looking through telescopes in my youth. And I've seen about everything you can see, but nothing in my youth that I would ever say was a UFO. Now here's but this is crazy. Last year, it was within the last 12 months, I'm walking my dog, and this is. The only person I've told this to is my boss at work. We had how do I start this? So we fly F-15s and F-18s out of here all the time. there was a pretty famous picture just came out last year of an F-15 coming out and going straight up, and he had a camera in front of him, and you could see his head, and then the background behind him was St. Louis Airport and the surrounding area. And I looked at that picture. I go, I live right there. So I had taken that picture. And I saw exactly where I lived. So I knew where I was in relation to everything. Now, we have a fairly new runway out here in St. Louis. And it was the runway that we tested that they do use it commercially, but Boeing uses it to test a lot of their airplanes. So when our Phantom Ray, the autonomous airplane, was gonna before it flew, we had to do a runway test, and where they just make it all by itself, go down the runway almost to flight speed and stop, turn around, bring it back, just to make sure everything's working. Well, that's on the side runway that people don't work with. Well, it turns out that side runway is pretty close to my house. And one day I'm walking the dog and I'm looking in that, and I'm just 2 houses down from where I live. And I see this thing, I see this glow kind of lift off, and it just went in an arc. It went from in front of me in an arc like a rocket launch to my right 90 degrees, and then it just disappeared. It just went. It was fairly bright at the bottom, and as it went up and up and up, and it got smaller and fainter, and it got to, I don't know, maybe third magnitude. From first magnitude to third magnitude, if that means anything to anybody. It just disappeared. And I go, oh, that was interesting. Anyway, I walked about a few more, walked a little way further south, and boom, there's another one taken off 30 seconds later. Identical flight path. Boom, disappears. 30 seconds later, boom, another one takes off. Identical flight path, disappeared. And it was bigger than a light. It looked like it was almost like a little bubble, and it just took it, and it was this orangish amber color. Thing is, it was just like what Buzz and Al Ward had described to me. And this thing took off and it went right to the same place and just disappeared. And I saw it 5 times in a row. And I'm thinking, whoa, so this obviously must be a secret Phantom Works project. We got a lot of stuff at Boeing. I worked in Phantom Works, but it's very siloed. I only knew about my one project. You don't know about any other projects going on in this huge hangar. Everything's walled off. People can't talk about anything. And I mean, this is the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. And it just happened. And so it's made me think, well, maybe what those guys saw was something, that we built at Boeing, who, I haven't told this to Buzz, but it just kind of recently happened, and nobody else saw anything weird taken off, and I knew where it was taken off from, the end of this runway, just a couple miles away as the crow flies, at Lambert. So yeah, I saw something, and I don't know what it was. I know it wasn't a helicopter. I know it wasn't an airplane. I know it wasn't a rocket, but it just took off, followed the same flight path, 5 of them in a row, and disappeared in the same place in the sky.
So we got a
new.
little update. We got a little update on the Shepard daughter, Ms. Shepard. I'm not sure if she's married or not.
I think her name's Laura.
The daughter of Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, because it landed a couple of hours ago. Literally.
Oh, it was today.
It happened today.
Well,
isn't that fascinating? Another coincidence.
It'll be.
Here we are on the 1-year anniversary of the last time we walked on the moon. And that's when she has her suborbital flight. Now, I don't think that was a coincidence. I'm wondering if that wasn't their way of kind of celebrating the new space situation. Interesting.
He
Good
flew on
choice.
Apollo 14, I think. I'm not sure when that took
Right,
off.
but it's still of an Apollo flight, and this and 49 years ago today, that was the last time we walked on the moon. In fact, I can tell you the exact time. Turns out that at 12:20 a.m. Eastern time or 9:20 p.m. Pacific time, that is when Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, let's see, yeah, Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt last walked on the moon, and then Ronald Evans was up in the command module, and that last walk was for 7 hours and 15 minutes. So
Yeah.
at 9 o'clock, 9:20 tonight, if you happen to think about it, that's the 49th anniversary of the last time we walked on the moon. And we will be, of course, celebrating that 1 year from today, and another Zoom breakfast on the moon. And so hopefully you will all be able to make it then. Now, that was I think that's basically all the questions that were here. There was mention about the fact that Dave Chevront said, NASA JSC medical folks do consider lunar dust to have the same health hazards as asbestos. That was, he heard that at a presentation a few months back. So
Yeah, I can believe that.
Yep. So you got to be careful with that stuff. You don't want to be breathing it. And I think, oh, he says that David Sharon also says Dylan Taylor, the CEO of Voyager Space and an active investor in the space industry, was also flying today on the New Shepard. So that's good to know. Anyway, anything anybody else wants to ask, please drop in the chat window or the Q&A. There is another Q&A. Let me see what that is. Is fine regolith dangerous like asbestos? We just answered that. What was your most memorable moment in your career, Ron? Most memorable moment. That's going to be hard. You had a lot of them.
Well, yeah, you know, I think flying payloads on the shuttle, that was pretty amazing. And doing the, you know, we were actually using the lab, one of the labs at KSC, integrating all these little experiments into our little mini lab. And we had, you know, had all the experiments, got them all in, got the lab tightened up and ready to go. And then we had officially turned it over to NASA and the NanoRacks guys. We were working really close with NanoRacks. And then we, of course, we got VIP seating to watch the last two shuttles go off. And for the first time in my life, I actually got to watch a landing. I saw the very last shuttle. I saw the landing from there, you know, at the landing site there.
Wow.
At the runway. And that was really exciting. Now, I'd seen many shuttles. I saw the very first shuttle go off, and we made a. I was also involved in I think it was the world's first television show about space. Cable access, Gil Cable TV, San Francisco, back in '81. We did a whole series of shows about space and the shuttle, and then we packed up, flew out to Cape Kennedy, taped the launch, piled into a van or into a, you know, went home, got to LA, piled into a van, it's a big camper van, one of the guys owned, went out to Edwards Air Force Base, got right there on the runway, and we filmed it coming in right in front of us, and the astronauts came out and they had a big press thing right there. We were like on top of the van looking down at them. That was all pretty memorable stuff. So, and I mean, I've seen a number. I saw the first element launch of the space station go off. We were, in fact, I forget which came first, that one or the John Glenn launch. John Glenn we were there at ShareSpace for John Glenn one of our guys was a bigwig in doing video streaming and on the internet. And it was either the John Glenn flight. I think it was John Glenn flight. We video streamed that on the internet. And for a little while, that video stream was the most streamed thing in history. Madonna had a concert a few weeks later and outdid us. But for a while, we actually had the largest video stream seen by more people in the world. We held a record. So part of the share space thing. And it was also pretty damn exciting flying a payload on the space station. This do you see this picture here? Oh, no, I'm not on.
No.
That iconic picture of the
you can go back on if you want.
Okay. Oh, let's see.
You have to get the screen share.
Oh yeah, screen share. So down here in the right-hand corner, this is a very iconic picture in NASA now. This is the only picture with a shuttle docked to the space station. I had payloads in there. Actually on the shuttle and aboard the station. So that's kind of exciting. So yeah, and I never anticipated Vandenberg was a really unique experience. We built the whole shuttle launch pad, and then we
Slick Six, actually.
Slick Six, $4 billion, and then the Air Force deserted it, just like that.
Yep. Well, that was
after 3,000 people.
After we lost that shuttle, and that, by the way, I got a story to tell you about that sometime.
Yeah, I got lots of stories about that one. But the NASA experience, I've never, flying in those airborne telescopes was, amazing, and the guys that used to fly those airplanes are all, all became shuttle astronauts, and I don't even remember their names. Some of them I do, but I couldn't tell you who was flying on what flight. But that was kind of exciting. The guys, they loved to take one in that Learjet, man. They hot dogged in that Learjet. We used to go up and they'd do a big parabola, and all of a sudden you're floating up, floating. So I got to do 0G. I was among the first, the space activists to do 0G. I never told that to anybody, and I never threw up. But
that's what they called it. They called it the vomit comet.
Oh yeah. Well, you don't want to throw up in that little Learjet. That wasn't going to be good.
So, Christine, do you have any last questions that you would like to ask Ron before we end this shindig?
No more questions for now, but I do want to thank everyone for participating, and we had an engaged audience with comments and questions. We were trying to figure out some things on the chat on the side, trying to get things to work. But anyway, and I want to thank Joe for hosting, and I guess your organization actually probably pays for the Zoom account. So thank you for that. And I want to thank Ron for presenting. Now, some of these stories I have heard, but not all of them. And I am just amazed at how much he's done in his 50-year career. Yeah. Amazing.
And I have a feeling we just saw the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, I could write a little, I can do a presentation on every one of these pictures you're looking at. But I'd like to say, Joe, thanks for inviting me to do this, and I guess it was Christine's idea, but I've been thinking about maybe getting some of these thoughts down on paper if I ever write a book, and at least I've got started now.
You got an outline.
Yeah, I got an outline, at least for the first, up through the bicentennial, because I left NASA and then I immediately got my car, drove around the country with a girlfriend, and we're in, for the bicentennial. That was something. And then when I got back, I had to worry about another job. So
had to go to work.
Yeah, I had to go to work. That's when I ended up at Vandenberg, working shuttle. So there you have it.
So you may
All right.
you might want to open up the chat because a lot of people are saying, you know, thank you, and you know, gotta go do some holiday stuff and stuff like that. But it is interest. You know, you may want to open the chat really quickly
Yeah.
so you can see the.
You're
the
right.
nice
Yeah.
elements.
And just a quick note that I did record this, and I do have, it does save out the chat window. So if anybody would like to see anything on the chat, drop me a line at joe.bland@nss.org, and I will send you on the chat window.
Okay.
We will also be, as I said, posting on the NSS and SAC L5. And oh, Christine, do you guys have a YouTube site?
We do. I can't remember what it's called. I'll have to let you
Well,
know.
I can send you a copy of the video as well, and you might
Yeah,
want to
I don't know if
top
we
of that
named
on
it.
there.
I don't know if we named our YouTube site Gateway to Space or St. Louis Space Frontier. It's one of those two.
Okay, so but it'll be there as well. Okay, so
Okay,
we'll have it in 3
awesome.
places. All right. Well, thanks, folks. It's 9:30. I got up early for this one, and but it was
Time for
very
breakfast
rewarding.
for
And
you.
yeah, yes, it was a breakfast, literally.
Oh, right, right.
And to those around the world who are with us to this day, thank you so much for sticking with us. And like I said, if you'll be able to tell your friends if they want to watch a fascinating interview. It's going to be out there on those YouTube sites. So that's it for today. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, my fellow NSS and space supporters. Bye-bye.
Lots of great comments. Thanks everybody for paying attention.
Bye-bye.
Long-time listener, you know, we like it when people pay attention.
Over and out.